In most retellings of Rome's grand history, the Emperor Gordian III never receives much attention, if only for the simple reason that he doesn't deserve it. Gordian assumed the throne at the age of just 12 or 13, and, like all emperors who rose to prominence at a young age, his reign from 238 to 244 was a failure that ended in disaster. But while Gordian himself is not particularly noteworthy, or even all that interesting compared to more salacious failures like the infamous Nero or Elagabalus, the reign of Gordian offers a stark portrait of the fundamental contradictions and tensions that were tearing the Roman world apart during the crisis of the 3rd century. But we are not telling his story because he was able to resolve these tensions. Instead, we will focus on why he could not. He and his advisors, of course, failed to rise to the occasion, and his tenure on the throne ended in murky circumstances, perhaps even in a violent overthrow by his Praetorian prefect, Philip the Arab, who would succeed him as emperor. If Gordian's death was indeed a violent one, then he would share the same fate as all his fellow emperors since Septimius Severus passed of natural causes in 211. A tragic list that includes both his grandfather and his uncle, who perished in revolt against Maximinus Thrax in 238. That so many would meet gruesome ends should cause the historian to pause and reflect on why men from divergent backgrounds who brought different strategies to bear in their efforts to solve the problems of their age all met with failure, and would pay the ultimate price for their inability to deliver Rome from its era of disorder and chaos. When assessing these rulers, the tempting thing to do is to write them all off as fools, simply because they so consistently fell to misfortune. While understandable, this does not spring from a careful reading of the sources, but instead from a feeling that if earlier emperors were able to make the empire function, then the men of the 3rd century have no excuse. It is the use of past performance to appraise results in a different era, and, in my opinion, the lazy result of a modern desire to act as if the crisis of Rome was somehow the fault of a handful of actors who simply blundered from defeat to defeat. Doing this is little more than a coping mechanism that wraps everything in a nice narrative that is easy to digest, but neglects the structural and social causes which were the true root of Roman decline, in favor of finding convenient scapegoats in its leaders. So, while the men at the helm were of course far from blameless, they were greedy, vain, and often utterly amoral, yes, but hardly incompetent. Each failed because they, and those around them, were unable to realize that they were now confronting problems which were outside the context in which their previous experience, or even case studies from Roman history itself, could be used as a guide. So vast and all-encompassing were the problems faced in the 3rd century that the mental framework of Roman ideology itself that would be utilized to generate new ideas was ill-equipped to address existing realities. Each man had been placed in an impossible position, and was reliant on outmoded institutions to deal with new threats. So, while looking at one emperor in isolation will never be enough to understand the forces behind 5 decades of ruin, I have chosen to focus on the life and times of Gordian III, because his 6 years on the throne offered enough breathing space that a prescient advisor could have utilized as an off-ramp to address the economic, military, or political turmoil facing the empire. That this proved impossible in turn reveals much about the structural limitations of Roman thought and action at this crucial juncture. If the study of great men reveals how they changed their era, the study of middling ones highlights the prevailing restrictions of their age, and shows why later changes ushered in by those titans of history became inevitable. If Gordian's reign was a tragedy, it is fitting that it began as a farce. He was only acclaimed emperor as a consolation prize for the Roman people, who were upset with the accession of the senatorial emperors Balbinus and Pupienus during the revolt against Maximinus Thrax. The people demanded a mere boy on the throne, puzzling as they surely knew he would be capable of exercising no real agency. They were insistent, however, due to their fond memories of his grandfather and uncle. The two emperors ordered some of their men to bring the child to the capital. Finding the lad playing at home, they lifted him to their shoulders and brought him to the capital through the midst of the crowd. Showing the boy to the people and telling them that he was the son of Gordian, they called him Gordian, while the mob cheered the boy and scattered leaves in his path. The Senate appointed him Caesar, since he was not old enough to be emperor. Gordian had simply been playing at home with friends, and suddenly found himself thrust into the life and death world of imperial politics. For all we know, Gordian continued to play, for he certainly played no role in imperial government, right up until the point when the divisions between the two senatorial emperors became so untenable that the Praetorians launched a violent coup to depose them. Gordian was spared, and now nominally ruled the empire. But in reality, administration fell to a court of advisors, and even these were subject to the whims of the Praetorian Guard, whose swords were the ultimate veto over any imperial decision. Gordian looked set to become a puppet of the Praetorians or predatory advisors, but through clever politicking on the part of his mother, Masia Faustina, Gordian proved able to govern through a coalition with elements of the Roman elite, aided by her ability to play off factions of the army against established rivals in the Senate. Faustina unexpectedly proved a savvy political operator, and it is a true shame that much of her story has been lost to time. She had seen her father and brother killed in the great machinations of imperial politics, and was determined to keep her son safe from the many forces desperate to claim his head. We can sympathize with a mother who had lost so much and was desperate to protect her son from the dangers of his position. Given the disorder of the age, it is a small miracle that she succeeded for 6 years. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. One of the key alliances brokered in this period was the marriage of Gordian to Tranquilla, daughter of the influential political player and military figure Gaius Furius Sabinus Aquila Timesitheus. A well-respected leader and competent administrator, Faustina surely recognized that this was the type of man who, under other circumstances, may have been the figurehead for any malcontents with the regime. Thus, he was seamlessly folded into the government as Praetorian Prefect, a position with enormous responsibilities. But any desire to usurp was negated by the hope that his daughter would bear the imperial heir. After this, his rule seemed not in the least that of a child or contemptible, since he was aided by the advice of his excellent father-in-law, while he himself, on his own account, developed considerable sagacity and did not let his favors be sold by the eunuchs and attendants at court through his mother's ignorance or connivance. It was a deft recognition of where potential threats to Gordian may arise, as well as an attempt to cope with the fundamental tension of the age. That the many problems of the empire required numerous, well-equipped armies in the field, but delegating too much authority and power would lay the groundwork for a revolt. This presented a problem not unlike that faced by Odysseus when he was forced to navigate between Scylla and Charybdis on his epic voyage back home to Ithaca. Concentrating military power in the hands of the imperial house at one location would result in the legions being overrun on another front, but empowering regional commanders invited destruction from within. This was the core of the Roman crisis, and one that remained unresolved for 50 chaotic years. Though attempts were made at cutting this Gordian knot, it would vex advisors to multiple emperors, and would not be adequately addressed until Diocletian. We must remember that armed rebellion was not just a theoretical problem. it was always a distinct possibility, for early in his reign, Gordian had faced a revolt in Africa led by the governor Sabinianus. Notably, this was the same province from which his grandfather and uncle had launched their own ill-fated uprising, and his family should have enjoyed stronger loyalties there. Fortunately for Gordian, Sabinianus had been quickly suppressed, but shortly afterwards there was a conspiracy of sorts on the troublesome Danube frontier. Details regarding the circumstances and motivations are unfortunately very sparse, but it appears to have been led by Tullius Menophilus, the senator who had organized the heroic defense of Aquileia against Maximinus Thrax. We are left to wonder if he was unhappy at the rewards he had received under the new regime, or perhaps if Gordian and Timesitheus were simply uncomfortable with a military hero commanding such a strong force, and ordered his execution in a purge. In this era, enemies were everywhere, including sometimes only in the imperial imagination. Though under the hand of Timesitheus and Gordian's court, the empire seemed to be righting the ship, this new coalition was deceptively precarious, and at best it was only ever addressing the core issues through half measures, bilging water but not plugging any leaks. The administration was unable to readjust due to its fundamentally conservative tendencies, magnified by a mutually inherited political ideology and restricted experience, which hampered their response to novel military and political realities. Roman thinking scorned true innovation, seeking past precedents for new policies. This nostalgia-tainted outlook had been with Rome since the beginning, but was particularly ill-suited to the new era. Increased delegation of imperial authority to a trusted subordinate can be traced back to Augustus himself, though recent trials and tribulations had necessitated experimentation within these narrow permissible bounds, as many emperors sought to find the right balance between centralization and local control. Gordian's variation on this theme placed tremendous authority that perhaps exceeded even his own in the hands of his father-in-law, hoping that family ties would safeguard loyalty. Previously, Maximinus Thrax had named his son as co-regent, and we cannot forget that Gordian himself had begun his reign sharing power with two senior emperors, who the Senate selected in order to divide civil and military affairs. Gordian's successor, Philip the Arab, would go even farther, creating another triumvirate of sorts by naming his brother as the supreme administrator of the East, and placing his father-in-law in charge of the northern frontier. All were attempting to strike a balance, but were unable to find the right approach. These efforts all failed because it was not enough for a subordinate to preside over victories. The emperor himself needed to be present in order to underscore his own legitimacy. This Philip was to discover when he deputized Decius to put down a revolt on the Danube, only for Decius to take charge of the troops he had been sent to quell, and lead them in a successful campaign against Philip. Decius's reign was even more clearly an effort to turn back the clock and recapture Roman dominance by emulating previous emperors and placating Rome's gods, who he believed were displaying their wrath towards the empire for declining religious devotion. But the harrowing persecution of Christians could not reverse Roman decline, or rescue it from the cycle of defeat and civil war. Seemingly, nothing could. Roman territory was simply too large, and the number of loyal family members that could be trusted to administer it were too few. The delegation of power to Timesitheus could only ever be a temporary solution in a world where death stalked even the wealthiest. When Timesitheus died on campaign in Persia, Gordian was not simply deprived of his most competent general, but also one of the few men he could even trust to be his general. Gordian's ultimate failure in the East after the death of Timesitheus would end up defining his legacy, as this war against Harper I, in retaliation for earlier Sasanian aggression, was an unmitigated disaster. Though, as I have discussed elsewhere, the role Philip may have played in Gordian's death is far from clear. What is clear is that Philip never should have been permitted to succeed Timesitheus as prefect. For, in addition to his dubious loyalty, Philip was a lackluster commander who was soundly defeated by Harper and then, later, Decius. That Gordian chose him at all betrays his increasing reliance on equestrians and men who were viewed first and foremost as loyal, instead of as actually qualified for their positions. Though not the focus of this video, it would be inappropriate to omit the economic freefall that was occurring alongside Rome's increasing political disorder. Gordian and his allies were unable to arrest Rome's steep economic decline, or improve the fiscal standing of the empire. Under his rule, Severan policies of debasement were continued so that commitments to the soldiers could be met. Though economic theory in the ancient world was not developed enough to properly diagnose the root causes of ongoing inflation, there was an understanding that pay for the army could not rise indefinitely, especially as economic infrastructure collapsed. Here, as well, Gordian was in a bind. Were he to act with prudence and cut pay or renege on bonuses, he knew he would be replaced by someone willing to meet the legion's increasingly untenable demands. The position of emperor had become a gilded cage. It offered luxury and prestige, but the emperor's ability to actually make his mark on the empire was tightly constrained. What was needed was radical thinking, but neither Gordian nor his team of advisors was capable of offering it. They saw the tensions created by material and ideological contradictions, but were unable to conceive of any truly systematic approach to addressing them. Rather, the regime was devoted to putting out fires one at a time as they appeared, and hoping for the best. But the situation was too complex to escape through attempts to recreate past successes. The cycle would continue until it was properly recognized that the crisis stemmed from an outdated ideological superstructure that was incompatible with the increasing need for flexibility against the myriad new threats beyond the frontier. Order could only return once it was understood that the empire, long united, must divide, so that divided it could unite. Rome still faced 4 decades of civil war and chaos before this could be achieved.